question for you to start with. What two things happened on the day that C.S. Lewis died? Jonathan?
Kennedy died.
That's the big one. President Kennedy was assassinated. Does anybody know the other one? Again, something, as with C.S. Lewis, it paled into insignificance. If you read the papers for November 1963, for that week, there's hardly a mention of the death of C.S. Lewis, because obviously it was such a tremendous event. The other person who died on that day was the writer Aldous Huxley, English writer but living in America, writer of Brave New World and other great books. He also died on the same day, November the 22nd, 1963. Now, as John has suggested and has appeared in his publicity, I was fortunate enough to be in Cambridge when C.S. Lewis was a professor there and a lecturer. Can I just make one other point, before I get on to that? I've prepared some handouts, because I'm going to not spend so much time on his life as I'm going to talk about his Christian faith and what he means to us as Christians. And so I've prepared handout selections from his works, which John will give out when it comes to the moment. So don't feel you'll have that. You won't have to try and take any notes if people wanted to. But coming back to this, so there I was. I finished my national service in Germany and came over to begin my university life. Lectures were not compulsory. And all my friends who were scientists used to comment on the fact that quite a few people who were reading an art subject seemed to go to hardly any lectures at all. Wasn't true on Carol's hair, our rector's wife, who was a medic, and I'm sure she went to lectures all the time. But it was a sort of take it or leave it. And even though there's some very eminent English scholars there, if you know anything about English literature and criticism in the 50s and 60s, you would have heard, for instance, of F.R. Leavis, the great literary scholar from Downing. Hardly anybody bothered to attend his lectures at all, partly because he was such a terrible lecturer, although he was a great writer. But the C.S. Lewis lectures, you had a job to get in. It was in the big lecture room at Mill Lane, but people queued to go in. They're the only lectures I can remember anybody doing that. It showed the power of him as a man. He didn't tutor people in the sort of one-to-one basis. In college we had two tutors. We had somebody called a moral tutor who was supposed to guard our morals with great difficulty with some people. And we had our subject tutor, but as a professor, he didn't have to have single tutorials, for which he was very grateful, because when he was at Oxford, he disliked heartily the people he had to deal with one-to-one, who included John Betjeman and Kenneth Tynan, amongst others. But what we did have were tutorial seminars, which meant at Magdalen College, where he was, on a Saturday morning, and some late afternoons as well, it was possible to go to a smaller group and to meet in that way, and therefore see much more of him as you got to know him better. Although I can't really say that most of us got to know him. He wasn't an easy person in some respects, I think. Somebody asked me the other day what he was like. The word gruff, I think, sums him up quite well at that stage. But he was a wonderful lecturer and such a superb intellect. And I've said to people in the past, if anybody challenges me to say that you can't be both an intelligent person and a Christian, I go back to C.S. Lewis and say his brain was the finest one I think I came up against. And if C.S. Lewis was a Christian, then we all should be. So I'm going to talk briefly about his life and writings, but spend more time looking at some of the things he said about being a Christian, which I think are a great help to us in our Christian lives. Certainly they've been a great help to me, so hence the quotations which I'll be giving out later. Clive Staples Lewis, who throughout his life was known as Jack, for slightly unknown reasons, but right from boyhood he was always called Jack. I don't think as students we got round to calling him Jack, but everybody else probably did. Born November the 29th, 1898 in Belfast, 3 years after his brother Warren, who was usually known as Warnie. In 1908, a traumatic year for him because his mother died of cancer, which he witnessed, and this affected him deeply. And his father's answer to having two small boys was to send them off to boarding school. So he was sent to a small boarding school in Watford, where his brother had been a pupil. He was very unhappy there. He was later, after the war, in one of his books, he described it as being at Belsen. So his father arranged for him to attend Campbell College in Belfast. But after 2 months there, he developed a respiratory disease, and so he was sent to Malvern, where it's a spa town, famous as a health resort, in an attempt to help him health-wise. While he was there, he abandoned his childhood Christian faith and became, in some ways, quite a serious atheist. After a few months there, he was moved again to Surrey to have private tuition, and this was successful in that it eventually led him to him obtaining a place at University College, Oxford. Just after he started at Oxford, the war started, and it's fitting really that I'm talking on Remembrance Day about C.S. Lewis, because although as an Irishman at that time, don't forget before the division and so on, as an Irishman at that time he could have been exempt from military service, but he decided to join up, and he was commissioned in the Somerset Light Infantry, and on his 19th birthday he reached the front line in Belgium, April the 15th, 1917. He was wounded in the back quite seriously at the Battle of Arras. Quite a few people, I think, have no knowledge of the fact that he was so involved in the First World War, and he wrote very vividly about his time there. An important event for him was meeting with a fellow officer called Paddy Moore, and they became great friends and talked about their families, and both of them vowed, if anything happened to them, to look after their respective parents. As it was, Paddy was killed, and I'm not going into any detail. Some of you will know of the fact that he lived for a long time at the house of Mrs. Moore, the kilns with Mrs. Moore and her daughter Maureen. Her husband had left her, but that was an important part of his war story. He also began writing, and his first poems were published at this time. In 1919 he returned to Oxford and received a first class in 3 subjects, which is quite an achievement. In 1924 he became a fellow of Magdalen. Now, just in case you're not acquainted with the spellings here, this is Magdalen College, Oxford, spelt Magdalen, without an E on the end. So if you go out and turn left and left again, you would come into Magdalen Street. When he moved to Cambridge, it was still called Magdalen College, but with an E on the end. But there he was, in Magdalen, fellow and tutor in English language and literature. And he became a Christian in 2 stages. And I'm going to quote 2 pieces from the book Surprised by Joy, which will be on your handout when it comes. The 2 stages of his conversion. First of all, believing in God, and secondly, believing in Jesus. And they are, I think, a most impressive statement of what conversion is about. The first one then. You must picture me alone in the room at Magdalen, night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of God, whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed, perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. I did not then see what is now the most shining and obvious thing, the divine humility which will accept a convert even on such terms. And then, 2 years later, I know very well when, but hardly how, the final step was taken. I was driven to Whipsnade Zoo one sunny morning. When we set out, I did not believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And when we reached the zoo, I did. Yet I had not exactly spent the journey in thought nor in great emotion. It was more like when a man, after long sleep, still lying motionless in bed, becomes aware that he is now awake. There, incidentally, is the great gift that Lewis had for expressing an idea or expressing an important truth by just quite an ordinary comparison. I'm apologising in advance. It just shows you can keep reading things through and not get them right, that I've got covet instead of convert in one of those quotations when you get them, so apologies for that. So this was obviously a very important moment in his life, his conversion in those 2 stages. The 1930s saw the publication of some of his books on English literature, which are great. And then in 1941, The Guardian published the Screwtape Letters in 31 weekly instalments, more of them in later. And Lewis began a series of radio talks with headings such as What Christians Believe and Christian Behaviour. In 1950, the first of the Chronicles of Narnia series, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, was published. In 1952, he met Joy Davidman, an American writer, first of all in Quebec, then later in London. Joy, at that time, was an ardent atheist who said eventually that the writings of Lewis brought her to Christ. In 1953, he was turned down for the professorship of English literature in Oxford. And it's generally assumed that this was a result of his Christianity. That because he'd been so outwardly propounding Christianity in his radio talks and so on, his fellow dons felt that he wasn't the right person to hold such an august post And in these days, when we think of ballots, he wasn't helped by the fact that the other person standing for the professorship was C. Day Lewis. And on the ballot paper, it said Lewis CS and Lewis CD. So probably not quite a few people didn't even vote for the right one, but there we are. As it happened, it was helpful to me because it was being turned down in Oxford, which meant that in 1954 he accepted a new chair of medieval and Renaissance literature in Cambridge. He gave his inaugural lecture on his 56th birthday. In April 1956, he entered into a civil marriage with Joy to secure her British citizenship. She was over here with her two sons. They'd seen a great deal of each other. There was a threat that she would be deported back to America. Her husband, who was an alcoholic and had various affairs, had eventually decided to leave her because he wished to marry her cousin. And so she was over here in England, in a way, getting away from this. So when Jack heard that she needed to stay, he agreed to enter into a civil marriage with her. But then, a few months later, she developed terminal cancer. She fell over one day and broke her femur, and it was found that she had cancer which was spreading. And so he married her in a hospital in Wingfield Hospital, a bedside marriage. Incidentally, only because I was getting this talk ready did I kind of realise that all this was going on at the time when I was going to his lectures and seminars. But in the background, this was the time of what was happening with Joy. Although they were married on the understanding that she only had a few weeks to live, she had a surprising period of remission before the cancer returned in 1960. They visited Greece and Italy together, as she wanted to do, and not long after their return, she died on July the 30th at the age of 45. Lewis, as I've told you, died on Friday, November the 22nd, 5:30 p.m., 1 week before his 65th birthday. Quickly, his writings. He wrote a lot of poetry, some of which was published. His first prose work was called The Pilgrim's Regress, 1933. He wrote a space trilogy before the Screwtape Letters. There was Radio Talks. Then, in many ways, his best-known works, of course, The Chronicles of Narnia, the 3 children's books. Then 5 more novels. And then, apart from works concerning the literature of the Middle Ages, we have a series of books on Christian themes, which I'm going to be using in a moment. So I want to consider them with you. I want to show you, if you don't already know, his contribution to Christian understanding and his quotations, which can help us in our everyday lives. So if, John, you wouldn't mind giving out the handout. I think probably just about one each. I did 30, expecting to have about 15 people here. Yeah, I think I'm counting quickly. There is, I think, 6, 8, 10, 11, 13, 15, 16, 18, 20. No, I think there's one each, actually, just about, because they're a little bit more than 30. And you'll see when you get them that the opening 2 quotations are the ones I've just read about his conversion, and they are both from this book, Surprised by Joy, which has a sort of punning title in the relation to Joy Davidman. Can you remember what time I started, John? I was to stick to your 40 minutes. I will reckon that I started about 1:15, all right? Have to obey the boss. So there's those two quotations from Surprised by Joy. And while they're giving out, let me just, rather an amusing little one from this. In this book, which is about his early life and his early experiences, he's got a very interesting chapter on what happened in the war, and he tells this story, which I think is rather nice. He was on a troop train from Rouen with 3 other officers. There were no heating. For light, we bought our own candles. For sanitation, there were the windows. The journey would last about 15 hours. It was freezing hard. In the tunnel just outside Rouen, there was a sudden wrenching and grating noise, and one of our doors dropped off into the dark. We sat with chattering teeth till the next stop, when the officer commanding the train came on and demanded to know what we had done with the door. "It came off, sir," said we. "Don't talk nonsense," said he. "It wouldn't have come off if there hadn't been some horseplay." As if nothing were more natural that 4 officers, being of course provided with screwdrivers, should begin a night journey in midwinter by removing the door of the carriage. Oh, it was a rather nice touch there. But that's Surprised by Joy. Now, standing up here as I am, and I'm trying hard to remember what's the title of the whole series of talks? On the top of your handout.
Light from Old Times.
Light from Old
Times.
Yeah, I felt C.S. Lewis was not quite Old Times, but it's nice to know we've got a link here with one of the great Puritan preachers, namely Richard Baxter, because the title of the next book, Mere Christianity, is a quotation from Richard Baxter, the great Puritan preacher, member of Cromwell's Commonwealth Army, born 1615, died 1691, and in a book which he wrote called The Saint's Everlasting Rest, he coined the phrase Mere Christianity to summarise the need to have a kind of basic belief in Christ and not to get too tangled up with other things. That's rather a glib summary of a great work by Baxter. But it's nice to be able to speak here and mention him in this talk. Here's a quotation then where Lewis is arguing with people who say, "Oh, Jesus, a great teacher." I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic, on a level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. And then another very, very telling quotation, I think. A Christian is not a man who never goes wrong, but a man who is unable to repent and pick himself up and begin over again after each stumble. Because the Christ life is inside him, repairing him all the time, enabling him to repent in some degree, the kind of voluntary death which Christ himself carried out. That is why the Christian is in a different position from other people who are trying to be good. They hope by being good to please God if there is one, or if they think there is not. At least they hope to deserve approval from good men. But the Christian thinks any good he does comes from the Christ life inside him. He does not think that God will love us because we are good, but that God will make us good because he loves us. Just as the roof of a greenhouse does not attract the sun because it is bright, becomes bright because the sun shines on it. Another great metaphor. You notice I've picked a number of quotations from Mere Christianity. It was this series of broadcast talks originally. He has great chapters on what Christians believe and on Christian behaviour. You only have to look at the chapter headings to see that he's writing about forgiveness, charity, hope, and faith, all important aspects of what it means to be a Christian. And so he stresses the need to work with other Christians. The one really adequate instrument for learning about God is the whole Christian community, waiting for him together. If Christianity was something we were making up, of course, we would make it easier, but it is not. We cannot compete in simplicity with people who are inventing religions. We are dealing with facts. Of course, anyone can be simple if he has no facts to bother about. And then, I think, a very forceful statement of what following Christ means. The principle runs through all life from top to bottom. Give up yourself and you will find your real self. Lose your life and you will save it. Submit to death, death of your ambitions and favourite wishes every day, and death of your whole body in the end. Submit with every fibre of your being and you will find eternal life. Keep back nothing. Nothing that you have not given away will ever be really yours. Nothing in you that has not died will ever be raised from the dead. Look for yourself and you will find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin and decay. But look for Christ and you will find him, and with him everything else thrown in. It's a great book, Mere Christianity. Then the next one is this. They're all paperbacks. The ones I've got, certainly, I don't know whether they are hardback edition. But this is the problem of pain. Very, very difficult subject to write about. But he has a kind of principle running through it, a quotation which I haven't got here. Pain is a metaphor to rouse a deaf world's problems. He looks, for instance, and again, I haven't got this, quoted this one, but here's a little extra. He answers this question: if God were good, he would wish to make his creatures perfectly happy. And if God were almighty, he would be able to do what he wished. But the creatures are not happy, therefore God lacks either goodness or power or both. This is the argument he takes up. This is the problem of pain in its simplest form. The possibility of answering it depends on showing that the terms good and almighty, and perhaps also the term happy, are equivocal. For it must be admitted from the outset that if the popular meaning attached to these words are the best or the only possible meanings, then the argument is unanswerable. And he goes on to say what he thinks those words mean. And then another quotation I have at number 7 from the problem of pain, the Christian doctrine of suffering explains, I believe, a very curious fact about the world we live in. The settled happiness and security which we all desire, God withholds from us by the very nature of the world. But joy, pleasure, and merriment he has scattered broadcast. We are never safe, but we have plenty of fun and some ecstasy. It is not hard to see why. The security we crave would teach us to rest our hearts in this world and pose an obstacle to our return to God. A few moments of happy love, a landscape, a symphony, a merry meeting with our friends, a bath or a football match have no such tendency. Our Father refreshes us on the journey with some pleasant inns, but will not encourage us to mistake them for home. Excellent, I think, that. Now, I hesitate to say this, as I know Richard is listening intently up there, but C.S. Lewis hated hymns. He wasn't perfect by any means, and that was one of his strong dislikes, and he often slips that into his writings. I sometimes suspect because he was probably tone deaf. I don't know. I can't prove that, but that would be a reason for saying that. But he was a great lover of the Psalms, and this is his reflections on the Psalms, where he looks at some of the quite difficult parts of the Psalms. His introduction tells us that in this book I write as one amateur to another, talking about difficulties I have met or lights I have gained when reading the Psalms, with hope that this might at any rate interest and sometimes even help other inexpert readers. I am comparing notes, not presuming to instruct. So he looks at the following aspects of the Psalms: judgment, cursings, death, and then things like the fair beauty of the Lord, sweeter than honey, praising what it means, second meanings, and the way that the Psalms are used in Scripture. And just one quotation from this: the relentlessness of the psalmist is far nearer to one side of the truth than many modern attitudes, which can be mistaken by those who hold them for Christian charity. It is nearer than the pseudo-scientific tolerance which reduces all wickedness to neurosis, though of course some apparent weakness is. The ferocious parts of the Psalms serve as a reminder that there is in the world such a thing as wickedness, and that it, if not its perpetrators, are hateful to God. So that's the side of Psalms which he's dealing with there. Prayer is the subject of letters to Malcolm. The increasing list of people to be prayed for is nevertheless one of the burdens of old age. I have a scruple about crossing anyone off the list. When I say a scruple, I mean precisely a scruple. I don't really think that if one prays for a man at all, it is a duty to pray for him all my life. But when it comes to dropping him now, this particular day, it somehow goes against the grain. And as the list lengthens, it is hard to make it more than a mere string of names. But here, in some measure, a curious law comes into play. Don't you find that if you keep your mind fixed upon God, you will automatically think of the person you are praying for, but that there is no tendency for it to work the other way round? Now, the disquieting thing is not simply that we skimp and begrudge the duty of prayer. The really disquieting thing is it should have to be numbered among duties at all. If we were perfected, prayer would not be a duty, it would be a delight. Someday, please God, it will be. Right, I'm conscious of my facing the wrath of John, so I'm going to leave you to have a look at the piece about miracles and recommend to you the book on miracles, because I did want to finish with saying something about the book, A Grief Observed. I'm saying this partly because after the death of my wife last year, I found this extremely helpful as a book. So anybody facing the same situation, I thoroughly recommend A Grief Observed. Written after the death of Joy, in one of the biographies of Lewis by A.N. Wilson, not the most sympathetic of Lewis's biographers, he writes this: "A grief observed, as he came to call the jottings which he made from almost the moment Joy died, have an almost novelist quality from its brilliant first sentence. No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear." And he goes on to recommend the book. And I've got a quotation which I think is very telling. After the death of his wife, this is Jack's answer to those who say, "Time is a great healer, or you will get over it." If you saw the BBC presentation of the cenotaph service yesterday morning, the remembrance, or if you saw the highlights, they did some interviews, and they interviewed an Irish couple whose daughter was just over 20 and was a medic who was killed in Afghanistan. And at one point, the father said, "People keep saying to us, time is a great healer, but it isn't." This is Lewis's take on this. Getting over it so soon, but the words are ambiguous. To say the patient is getting over it after an operation for appendicitis is one thing. After he's had his leg cut off is quite another. After that operation, either the wounded stump heals or the man dies. If it heals, the fierce continuous pain will stop. Presently, he'll get back his strength and be able to stump about on his wooden leg. He has got over it. But he will probably have recurrent pains in the stump all his life, and perhaps pretty bad ones. And he will always be a one-legged man. His whole way of life will be changed. All sorts of pleasures and activities that he once took for granted will have to be written off. Duties too. At present, I am learning to get about on crutches. Perhaps I shall presently be given a wooden leg, but I shall never be a biped again. That seems to me such a wonderful statement about what the death of somebody really means. That's part of A Grief Observed, another paperback. Now, I didn't intend to actually go through the screw tape letters with you. As you know, they are letters from a senior devil to a young devil, telling the sort of thing to do to stop people being Christians. Very, very telling. Well worth a read on its own, but take those home and have a look at some of those and see if any of what he's saying applies to you. So I've had to rush through what is such a vast amount of material. When I started to do it, I didn't realise how much it was, and there are at least a dozen other books which could have been quoted. But I just want to finish with what his stepson said when he married Joy. There were the two boys, Douglas and David, who came with her. There he was, a crusty old bachelor, having to take them on. And this is what Douglas wrote later. "I've never met a man before or since who lived Christianity as keenly as Jack did. He showed me how to get through life, minute by minute, from the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep, being a Christian. Christianity for him was not what you said, it wasn't what you wrote, and it wasn't what you believed in. It was what you did because of what you believed. I leave that as the last word.